Hello, everyone. This is another Freedom to Feel conversation, and my guest today is Dr. Bryan Hong. He's an author, speaker, and business school professor. He's the author of Evolution to Purpose: Choosing a Life of Authenticity with Work. So, this is my brief introduction to you, Bryan. The question that I love asking, I will skip for today, but there's another one. What inspired you to become a professor, and what was the main purpose of writing a book titled Evolution to Purpose?
Oh, good question. So these are two seemingly totally different answers, I think. So the why the professor definitely didn't start out that way. So my parents are actually both professors, and growing up, that was actually the one job I was very sure I wasn't going to do. So so my first job was actually out working on Wall Street in New York. I studied finance as an undergrad. I had none of the preparation or interest in ever going down the academic road. It was only by doing a series of jobs in my 20s when I was basically getting to points where I was like, oh, this isn't exactly it for me. And then at some point in my mid 20s, well, what is, and what is it that I felt was missing in a lot of the jobs, and what I really love, right? I mean, we all have different trade-offs we make with the jobs we do, but I wanted intellectual freedom. That was huge for me. I was the guy who was always at work asking questions, and probably too many questions. And so Professor ended up being a natural fit for that. Why the book? That was also never a plan or an aspiration that I had, even after becoming a professor, because I know it's very common that lots of professors will write books, but definitely not me. It was really just, over the many years of being a professor, I had many students come to me really for career advice, which would turn into life advice, and I started to notice these patterns. And then I started to notice that we were not really doing anything as a school to help students with these questions. And then I realized that actually there wasn't a lot out there, and that gradually turned into, well, somebody should write a book. And so that's the short answer of it.
There's a question in your book that really it's really a chapter 16. Who are you really? Is a question that you ask.
Mm.
To me, that's the most important question. If there is something important in this which we call life, it would be this question: who are we? So, and
Yes.
then you explore, you navigate the realm of exploring that question, and I have a whole page here, on that chapter. That's my favorite chapter for a reason. So, but talk to me for a moment about this idea of becoming aware of who we are.
Um, it sounds like such a deep and profound, question, right? And in some ways it is, but when you're working in education, actually, it's a much more practical, straightforward kind of thing. So let me sort of explain it in a couple ways, right? One is that if you take a step back, and you look at, well, what do you learn in school? Did you ever take a class on you? Right? I mean, I certainly didn't. I took a lot of classes that I think in many different ways probably told me what I should be or what they thought I should be. That happens a lot, but it's not done explicitly. But there was never the time and the space really to set aside, know what really would be a good fit for you, right? And have someone kind of advocate for that. And so, structurally, we're already not there, right? But where this would come out, with my students is when we'd sit in my office and they'd come to me for, I don't really know what I want to do, or maybe they would think they knew what they wanted to do. And something that would always kind of bother me, if I feel like, I don't know if they really know why they're making these choices, I would just ask them, okay, so why do you want to do this? Even that first question, some students, they'd struggle with it and they wouldn't actually know why. It's as if someone had told them, that's what they should do. And so you see that enough times. I mean, you get to the question, who are you really? I could have just asked the students that question, but they would have been shocked and said, well, what does that mean? So it's much easier to ask, why do you do what you do? But it's really the same thing in the end, right? If you know why you're doing something, this means you know something about yourself, right? And what I think, it's not just students, right? It's many people in this world, they kind of don't, right? They don't know themselves well enough to answer why. And So not surprisingly, a lot of people aren't happy.
Right. And that really, that's a beautiful connection that you make between purpose, connected to what we are, who we are, finding out the answer to that question, and happiness. It's an interesting connection there, this relationship. So, talk to me for a moment about that. Are they really interconnected, these two concepts of purpose and happiness?
Yeah, they are. Though the really tricky thing, of course, is, well, what do you mean by happiness? Right? There's people have different definitions. Our society, there are plenty of people who will sell, on things like social media or in ads, like, "Hey, I'm really happy, and if you just make enough money, you will be just like me." Or there's always something tied to that. And of course, the reality is, if you look real closely, there's something empty about all that. And anybody actually can figure that out. That's not rocket science, but it's easy to kind of fall for it. The kind of happiness that I'm talking about is not the sort of happiness that you might get if you go and gamble in Vegas and you win, let's say, right? I mean, that's one form of something we might call happiness, right? Certainly it's not tragedy or sadness, but that's not what I'm referring to, because there are a lot of jobs that will give you that kind of dopamine hit. But I'm talking about something kind of more profound, that there's something that feels good about waking up every day, knowing that whatever it is that you're doing and how you're spending your time connects to something inside you in what people would say is meaningful, right? Or fulfilling. And that's very different than just winning, right? Yeah. And so that's where I would say the happiness I'm talking about connects to purpose.
Yes, that's exactly how I feel. Yes. It's connected to something that I believe. A lot, we use the word believe instead of knowing, because a lot of people will connect to that better for some reason, relate to the word believe. But it's really a knowing, in my case, that
Yeah.
everything is connected, or all life, it's connected. Is that something that most people are willing, I ask that question a lot, are willing to really dive into it?
It depends on the person. So, Valeria, this is really interesting that we're having this chat, because in my world, in the schools that I have been teaching at historically, I mean, these are people who want to go work on Wall Street. And so they're already conditioned, programmed, and told a message that is not exactly what you've said, to be quite candid, right? They're going after something different because they have a certain belief system with them. What's very interesting, I think this is always, at least I haven't seen the counterexample yet, but I've seen this over and over again. If you really kind of take someone on a journey when they start off not knowing who they are and just buying into the, I just want to make a lot of money, or whatever it is, right? Everybody often buys into something. And they start going through this journey of like, okay, so what is it that would align with you? Whether it's by coincidence or because of the way that we're all built as humans, it always ends up being something about contribution to someone else, right? Almost without exception, right? And so maybe the way it shows up is a little bit different if someone wants to be a dancer, an artist, or they want to go build a great business. But there's always something usually about contribution to everybody else. It just happens to kind of go that way, right? Even without being like, well, shouldn't you do, even if you didn't start there, that's kind of where it goes. And if you take that far enough, like, what is the version of all of those things that would really make someone feel the best and most fulfilled? It is the version that you talk about, like the kindness and the understanding of the connectedness. But many people don't know that that's actually what it is. It's almost like a step by step. So the short answer is, in my office conversations, we don't necessarily talk about kindness as the way, but it somehow always kind of goes that way, if that makes sense.
It does. I love to
Yeah.
hear that. And that's so true. And to me, it's because it's natural, isn't it, Brian? It's
Yeah.
something that's so interwoven. It's within us, even though, like you said, we might not have, maybe we have not recognized that yet,
Right.
realized that yet. And for me, is a spiritual, has been through my spiritual journey, really, to find that as truth.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a journey. So if you start, if someone's far away from that, and that's not step one, but there is a realization at some point. It's like, oh, wait a second, right? There's something bigger, and then So, Valeria, as you can imagine, my conversations being a business school professor one-on-one with my students, we're not necessarily getting spiritual, right? Or what people would think of as a spiritual conversation. But if you run that out long enough, you kind of can't avoid it, right? At some point, because when you get into questions of why do you do what you do, who are you really, like, why do you think you're here, right? You sort of get there in a different way, if that makes sense.
And the idea of happiness, I asked a lot of that question, and I did ask recently to somebody who is actually an expert per se. That's his job to really explore, what happiness is, and how can we be happy finally. But I asked him that question. Is that the purpose of life, to be happy? And he said yes. That's the reason we are here, in a way.
Yeah, that's wow, that's a very deep question, right? How does one go about answering this? I think it depends on how you define happiness, but also about your philosophy. So, in the way that I think about happiness in the book, right, how I'm defining it, when it's about the alignment of the things inside you with what you're doing and how you're kind of manifesting out in the world, yeah, that definitely is part of the point of being here, right? I mean, again, that's me, of course, talking about my values there, but it seems sort of strange if it wouldn't be part of the story, right? And in fact, when we look at human stories, I don't care who you are or what your biography is, so much of everyone's biography actually is about that, right? Like they're trying to go about in the world, whatever they're trying to do, it's about figuring out themselves and what they want and kind of dealing with the different outcomes of life that come from that, right? And that's in every version that, right? So of course I would say yes.
Yes, yeah, and I absolutely agree too. There's some people make a distinction between happiness and joy, that they are different. Do you see that too?
That's true. It is called that. That
Yeah.
just means I have to take this question very, very precisely, right? This is a good question because I'm now in real time trying to figure out what do I think joy is and how it compares to the fairly precise definition of happiness that I have. Joy, I think, is a state that can come from something that is not exactly this heavy, big picture. Am I doing what's aligned with me? The kind of bigger purpose. Um, Joy can come from kind of just an immediate present experience, right? Like, I'll give you an example. A few months ago, I was walking down the street and I walked by these musicians just playing on the street, right? Totally unexpected. They were really good. And it was very clear that everybody around them, there started to be a circle that was forming, was really enjoying what they were doing. And you could feel the energy of what they were doing. That's joy. Is that me finding my life purpose? Not really, right? It's a different thing. There's nothing wrong with that, but conceptually I can see that joy can come from maybe more things, right, than what I'm referring to. So they are a little bit different, and both good things.
It's the interesting thing about, I mean, for me, what came up for me when I titled the platform Fit for Joy, and I wrote a book about that, is that we are already in this state of experiencing joy, no matter how rich, poor, sick, healthy, it doesn't matter. It's something that it doesn't require anything from outside. Nothing to happen. It already happened in a way.
Yeah. That's so interesting because when you asked me this question, my first image wasn't the musician story that I told you. I was thinking of like a monk meditating, um, that they're able to sort of get to a certain place with that. And certainly I think that can be yeah, a state that you can achieve also in this way. It's a really interesting question that you ask about joy, right? If we can sort of understand it a little bit about, where does it come from? Is it natural or is it something we need to go out there and get or go experience? And yeah, I'll be honest with you. As I'm talking about this, I think I had to have to think about this more to give a better answer, but I'll stick with the one I gave.
I love that picture of the monk, right? It has something, we call it spirituality, but it's really knowing what we are. It's going, and we don't have to go that deep. It actually takes reflection, contemplation, and meditation. That was my case. To really find that ground, it's just incredibly peaceful. And from that, kind of joy arises. We become happy for no reason per se.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, so my experiences with meditation are also similar, right? Because there's part of, I remember I did a 10-day meditation retreat for the first time, right? Like a few years ago. And the first several days was really just about getting that voice, in my case, often a critical voice, but just a voice who's like talking endlessly, to start to quiet down, but also realize actually, if I'm looking at the voice, wait, that's not exactly me then, right? Like there's something else going on there. It's one thing to say that, it's another to actually see that and experience that. And then you start saying, well, wait, I'm here, right? And so what's going on there? And it's an interesting path to kind of come to that realization, because when we're not in that state, right? When you're not present, you're not fully aware, you often just kind of feel like that's who you are, right? That voice, right? Or you feel like that's kind of your true state, but it isn't really.
I wonder if that could happen in business school, if any kind of school, any kind of educational system, where humans as children they would be taught or guided to already find the real them, the true self. You actually use that word in your book. I think you called, is it the true self or the true?
Yep. I mean, you're preaching to the choir, right, Larry? I wrote a book on this because I feel like we're not doing this enough, or maybe at all, right? I think that's the tragedy of it, and it's given what I know now about how much work it takes, to have someone grow up into adulthood and figure this out, because it's not like, a math class and you're just learning addition or subtraction. There's a much deeper, and it's so individual in so many ways, right? And that's supposed to be celebrated along the way. So much of our education system is about standardization, actually, right? And about evaluating to some external standard, which doesn't actually do a great job of predicting what happens to you in life later anyway, right? And we know that. And so, I feel like the gap is just enormous. There are things like Montessori schools that obviously try to take a different approach to this, but by the time you get to a university is not designed generally to help with this much, right? In fact, they make this weird assumption many times that you've already figured out through your major choice or something else that you already would know, despite the fact that there's really no reason to think that you should know, right? So, and that's where I get frustrated, right, when I see that. So to my student, and it's funny that you asked this question, because it's such a straightforward, simple question, right? And yet, the way that this came about, when I had all these student meetings in the early part of my career, and I started to realize, oh, there's a problem. I actually did not feel like there was anybody in terms of colleagues that I could talk to about this, who would care, to be quite honest, right? And so I felt quite alone with this. And so the subject that I teach is actually not this at all, right? And so, if you see me in the classroom, I'm not talking about any of the stuff that I'm talking about with you, but I felt like this was important enough, and I'd seen enough of this that in my last class, I set aside like half an hour, and I thought, you know what, I'm gonna just put out some slides, and I'm gonna talk about some of the things you and I are talking about. And I just want to say, hey, look, like, we're not doing these things right, and you guys need to sort of appreciate that you can be happy, but we're not really helping, right? And it was kind of the message. um and that speech resonated. The first time I did it, I was like, I don't know if they're going to hate this, or if they're going to think it's a waste of time, or that it went well. For a certain group of students, it resonated so strongly, actually probably even more than the class. I was like, huh. And then I started to do it for several years, and I got the same reaction. I was like, okay, there's something really big here, right? And so this is the answer to your question is, I squeeze it in a little bit right at the very end, but if I were to make a whole class on it, I would get in trouble, right? I would get called in, and they would ask me, what are you doing, right, teaching this stuff? So, do I think that there's a need and a space for it? Yeah. Do I think we're going to get there eventually? But there needs to be way more of a conversation around this, and I still haven't seen that mostly.
Yeah, so the educational system is not open to it. Not yet. No.
Not at the moment.
Yes. But that happens with all structures, right, Brian? It takes a long
Yeah.
time to be deconstructed.
Yeah.
It's not.
And as you know, Valeria, structures these days seem to be getting transformed. So we might see change.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. So let me see the notes that I made. So your book has two parts. Part one, living with the machine. Part two, evolution. So another question that I have is it's an open, simple question about evolution, this idea of growing, evolving. What is your vision for that? What's the evolution of human, what it means to be a human being?
It's a really good question. So if you take a really big step back and you look at kind of the timeline of how humans lived, so far, one could probably make a pretty good argument that humans, for most of the time that we've been on the planet, have just been trying to survive, right? And just try to figure out how not to kill each other, how to eat enough, how to kind of figure out what the basics of a material good life are, right? And it just took us forever to even begin to get to a good place with that, right? Most of the progress of that has really happened in the last 200 years. So, slow start by any stretch of the imagination. Now what we see, put aside whatever you're hearing in the headlines about worries about the economy, just big picture, we're seeing more people who don't have to worry about that as much, particularly in younger generations, who didn't grow up, with a lot of that stuff, wondering kind of like, all right, so what is it that we're supposed to be doing? Because what hasn't changed is society's kind of model, right? And what I see, and we could have a whole nother podcast about this, Valeria, is particularly with those in the below 30 age range. I don't care what country you're in, it's happening everywhere. There's a greater awareness and dissatisfaction with what I'll call the social contract is. In the US, we might call it the American dream, is like, you get yourself a big house, a couple cars, dog, and have a certain amount of material wealth. But if you look closely at that, that's kind of it, right? When we talk about that. And I think what we're seeing is more and more people not happy with just that, right? That there's got to be more going on. And it's partly because for the first time, a lot of people actually can ask that question. And that's what I've noticed more and more, that the gap here is that there's not a lot of great answers coming back yet to people who are asking. Yeah.
So for some of us, it's very clear that's not just surviving, but it's interesting to see how divided everything is, right? How some people say 50% of the population, but I think it might be even more than that. More of us, of people who are looking deeper into reality.
I think that that's true. So, I mean, Valeria, if we look back, even back in ancient times, there were spiritually enlightened people, right? I mean, that's where we get all that of, pick your religion, pick the old text, right? Who had profound insights even back then, right? So even though the big picture was that most people just weren't there certainly were individuals that were, or small groups of people. And it is true, I do think that this is the case, that now we're seeing kind of more of an opening to that. Maybe because, I'll argue, because I'm trained in economics, that's because more people can afford to, maybe. But it may also be that it's just kind of time for humans to kind of think about, well, to your point, the evolution, what exactly are we supposed to be doing here? Because, it's not that, whatever we've been doing for the last however many years. So I do think that that's happening. So that's where I think, personally, the whole purpose thing really fits in. An interesting question that someone could ask, right? And I got asked this multiple times by my students, is like, all right, I get that purpose is important, but like, how am I supposed to find out what my purpose is, right? When we just talked about how school doesn't help with that and all that stuff. One of the things that, I think is really important for a small percentage of people, and again, this is my observation, so Blair, if you see something different, please let me know, but there's a small number of people who they find a calling, and they start, they saw it from age 5 and they've always wanted to be that, and that's them, right? That's not most people. Most people don't suddenly have something fall from the sky tell them what it is so clearly they should be doing. And that's, I think, on purpose. Wait one of the things that's really amazing about human beings that we take for granted is that it's really true that if you have a vision of the future, right? And when I say vision, I don't mean just a goal, like an actual image of I'm going to be there and I'm going to build this, right? And it might be enormous. It might seem crazy. It might seem unreasonable. Um, that is actually, when you do that the right way, that's connecting with purpose, right? That's where it comes from. And so when you ask about evolution, I would love to see a world, right, where people are basically manifesting that, right? It's like, oh, I've got a vision to do XYZ, right? And it's really kind of connecting on the inside. It's not, I'm doing this job because I was told to, or this is what people like me do, right? Or all these other narratives that people often use that limit them. Um, to sort of see that mindset shift in a different way en masse, that would be the real sign of evolution in my mind.
Do you have personally? Do you have a vision for your, let's say, your evolved self, 50 years,
That's
30 years from now?
It's a really good question. So the book I view as just kind of a way to, it started off with those 30-minute speeches at the end of the classes I would just squeeze in. And then I wanted to kind of dig deeper into those ideas, and that turned into the book, right? Writing is a great way to clarify your ideas to see if, it makes sense and what do you really think. Um, and now it's really about going from the book to actually trying to do. So I do have a coaching business on the side, but that's just individuals, really, right? For the most part, right? With the occasional workshop. What I would love to see, if schools aren't willing to do it, and that seems to be the case right now still, is a place where people can go to actually kind of start their path in a structured way of how to get to purpose, if you will. Some of it is with ideas from the book, but so much of this is really kind of about the individualized experience. And whether it's because of having had hundreds of meetings with students over the years and just kind of seeing patterns, or just some other kind of ability I have, now I'm at the age where when I meet someone, let's say after 30 minutes, if we're having a real conversation, I feel like I have a pretty good sense of what they could do. Not in terms of ability, but in terms of like what would be their purpose. And it's not me imposing it on them, because if I ever say it to them, they're like, that's it, right? Like that's often. And so being able to do that at scale, I haven't figured out how to do that yet, would be part of my vision, at least for how to see the world kind of be a little bit different.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful, though. So it would be like a school of purpose, right? Or a school to purpose.
Sure. Yeah,
Yes.
maybe
Huh?
yeah.
Love that.
Many fewer words to say the same thing. You did a great job.
It's very, very simple, like taking life, this, which we call life, moment by moment, and kind of seeing how we respond to, what life gives to us. Could be connect. I love connections, though, being around people, and I think it seems
Hmm.
like to me that the evolution of learning, of achieving all these great concepts, happiness, joy, peace, it will one day will really happen in communities. Like we'll be together, just listening to one another.
Yes. Yes. I do think that is definitely, if we imagine healthy versions of the future or healthier versions of the future, this is something that we absolutely need. I mean, community is something, and people have different definitions of it, but it's really essential. And we kind of all had it when we were in villages, or like, long ago, right? As primitive as that might seem to us, right? I mean, at least you had people who knew you and you felt like you were part of a group, and that wiring hasn't changed, right? And so part of, I think, it's very hard to prove this in quantifiable terms, but I do think part of why we have many of the mental health issues we have, a lot of the social problems that we have, is because we kind of built a society that was dividing everybody, right? Not just between different, groups of people, like in different countries, but like even within communities, right? And that division has ended up damaging us in so many ways, right? That we don't even understand because we're sort of used to it, right? Um, and how do you heal that? Well, you heal that by going back to kind of what the old ways were on that one, right? That we have a community.
Going a little bit, not deeper really, but just kind of saying something that I heard another day somebody told me here on the podcast that the reason why we have mental health issues in at all, it's because at some point we have not been accepted or loved or seen.
Yeah, it's probably so true. It's scary, right? If you, so I've thought about this in much simpler ways because sometimes this would come up in like comments I would have with colleagues in different. I worked in finance, I worked in consulting, I worked in academia. None of these are professions that are necessarily great with kind of open vulnerability and community as workplaces, frankly, right? And I think everyone would acknowledge that. But I remember one of my coworkers one time said, wouldn't it be great in the workplace if we just got a hug at the end of every day at work? Which sounds ridiculous on the one hand, right? That's the knee-jerk reaction. And then I really thought about it. I was like, if everybody had something like that at the end of every day, I'm pretty sure I would see violence go down, right? Or we'd see that in society. I'm pretty sure we'd see all kinds of things not be the same types of problems that they are now, right? Which sounds silly in some way, and yet also seems incredibly profound that it could be something that simple, right? And so, absolutely, there's an issue there, and one that we don't, this, Valeria, right? We have other ways of dealing with mental health, right? We give medication to people, and we do other things. So, not great substitutes for this, right?
And when it comes to healing, I don't know about curing anything, but healing has to do with finding the root cause of whatever the symptoms are.
Yeah.
That's how it works. But I love that suggestion. It would be amazing, like in business school, the hug.
It sounds ridiculous, right? And by the way, I've never actually said that out loud before, right? Certainly not to colleagues or students. So if this shows up somewhere, they'll be like, "What is he talking about?" But no, I do think it's an interesting question to ask. I have a suspicion the effects would be incredibly dramatic.
And interestingly enough, that's something that I have come across recently too, with the psychiatrist that I interviewed. That he said before he gives any medication to anybody, any of his patients, he would try to do whatever it takes to calm their brain, like use the approach, whatever methods, natural methods to calm their nervous system. And then see if the symptom of bipolar or whatever diagnosis they have will arise, because he found that to be true. If we can calm the brain, then whatever the symptom for the illness, the mental illness, will subside.
It's such the reason why I think it's such a big question that it's kind of almost difficult to imagine is I have a suspicion that if we were to sort of see a society where everything like this happened, like I almost think the society would just look very different, frankly, right? In a way that would be shocking to us, that we would sort of say, how could it be that, this was the answer that we have been ignoring, right, all this time, right? When we talk about social problems, when we talk about mental health, nobody raises their hand and says, wait, why don't we just do the hug thing, right? Everyone's like, we need these programs, we need medication, we need all these things. And it's not that you don't, it's just one can't help but wonder if there might have been another answer.
I think there are some communities that they are small, that they have been testing this, kind of already putting this into practice.
Yeah.
And they have they see the results are very clear. But
Yeah.
yes, from that to becoming something, let's say the standard, something that everybody adapts to, and everybody's kind of joins that kind of idea, then it depends on the structure. Yeah, and when we have way too many societal structures that they seem to be very rigid, and that's doesn't help for now. But I think we are moving in the right direction. I really feel that way.
That would be my sense too. Yeah.
Yeah. So you say purpose comes from knowing our true self, never from following the external world. So we talked about that. I'm revisiting this idea because it's so crucial. And do you actually suggest that we kind of practice this with our children? Is that the best way to do it, to start early?
So the short answer is yes. I think that, there are many cultures and households where the idea of good parenting is that you kind of tell your kids what they're going to do with their life effectively. right? And you do it with the best of intentions. So it's not that, there are no reasons, no sensible reasons why someone would do this. Um, the tragedy of that is, of course, is that if you take that approach, and the kids, of course, are always interested in making their parents happy, right? Even well into adulthood, right? That this is not something that ends. It creates a dilemma then for every child in that culture, and it certainly doesn't value then whatever their own individual traits are that frankly probably need to be expressed if they're going to get to a point where they feel a sense of purpose. And so there's an inherent problem there. Now, to your question about parenting, my personal view of it is that what every parent should be doing is trying to help their kid figure out what it is that is, and then help them express that, right? Mostly because that's the best ticket for them to kind of have the most energy to put into whatever they want to dedicate their lives to. And in that sense, be very, very successful, right? In a way that they feel successful, right? And all these other things. Um, and that a parent needs to take that leap of faith, but that is not the prevailing mindset of many cultures or many households. And I'm well aware of that because I see many of those kids, right, as students in my.
Basically, parents are just passing on their own ideas of how life should be and how their children should be. Do you have a suggestion when it comes to guiding children to find their true self?
It's a good question. I think when you're younger, so the way I think of this, right? I mean, kids don't really, I mean, if you took a 15-year-old and you said, all right, we're going to spend 5 hours now, we're going to figure out what you should do with your life, we're not really going to succeed, right? Because there's just too many things that haven't emerged, right? By the time we're talking about university years, you've got something I think that you can really work with. Now, that doesn't mean you don't do anything before that. I think preparing someone to kind of get ready to be conscious of a process of where you even just write down your interests and start asking, like, okay, so why, right? And just getting people into the mindset of like, all right, so this is a question that I can ask next time when I need to reevaluate, but we don't even do that, right? So kind of, I'd say pre-university, I would say just getting them to just get into the exercise, and maybe they'll get some hints, right? Maybe the answer will change later, of course, but that exercise is, it's like starting to use a muscle, right, of self-reflection that you haven't used before. And so that when you get to university, that muscle is a lot stronger and you're kind of in a much better place. One of the things I noticed with the students who came to my office is that their muscles had never been used, many of them, right? It didn't matter how smart they were. They just hadn't. So it was a struggle, right? And we were having conversations that it was just stuff that could have been addressed a long time ago so that we could have a different conversation that's much further along. So that's one thing I've noticed. So even just getting, pre-university, getting them to ask the question, just write it down or just talk about it, right? By university, you can start to see more of these puzzle pieces come together, and then have more of what we might call like a really kind of career/life conversation. Like, what do you want, right? And why do you want it? And then helping them kind of see how much of it might be something that someone else has told them that they should want versus them, but without doing it in such a kind of imposing way, right? So that's part of the art of what I do. And so that that process, I think university is very, very important because by the time they graduate and you're in a workplace, no one in virtually any workplace is asking kind of what would really align with you because that's not what they're built for, right? So the infrastructure has really changed at that point. And so you need to be someone who's aware enough of their own self that you can really start to figure that out on your own. And we don't do that. We don't prepare people to be that ready by the time they go out there.
Probably heard about this. What do you want to be? You remember, like in school, somebody teacher, and then a child said, "I want to be happy." Isn't that really fundamentally what we're looking for, really?
Yeah. No, it's interesting that was an answer that you've heard in that story. Here's what I know. I haven't checked recently, so maybe the date has changed, but I don't think it has. A survey of people, I think they're like 12 or 13-year-olds, maybe even teens. I don't exactly remember, asking them, what do you want to be when you grow up? And the answer actually that came out, Valeria, these days is famous. And the reason why is because I think they're seeing a lot of these influencers and all these other things. Um, you know, so that, is that happy, right? From what we know about a lot of these individuals, maybe not, right? And so I haven't yet. So what we're seeing in that age range is not necessarily evidence of kind of movement toward what we've been talking about in terms of evolution, but maybe a shift to yet another distraction.
But also goes back to, you see, limiting beliefs. You probably heard about that. So, our
Hmm.
belief systems. So, if we have them in place already since we're children, especially when it comes to not being accepted by our parents, or we perceive we have this understanding, somehow in a child mind that we are not really being loved, accepted,
Hmm.
then that would change everything. That we will just live, go through life looking at ourselves and others through those lenses. It was my case. We got to look deeper. Actually, is a job that, of course, adults have to do for them in the beginning, therapy and all that. But I think healing, it's really a huge part of it. Healing in the sense of kind of inspecting, investigating our belief systems, because they become thoughts, and then thoughts become actions, and then actions become our destiny, basically.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree. So you're right. So before I said, even what are you interested in? But to your point, what are your beliefs, right? Um, and kind of where did they come from? Are they true? I will say, because I've taught, at multiple different institutions, um, some kids, it's not that they're smarter or more capable, but they are born with different beliefs that are going to help them achieve more. There are other kids who grow up in households or maybe environments where they just weren't ever told maybe that they have that, ability. And so they don't, right? They don't have that same kind of aspiration. And that's actually one of the biggest differences I've seen among students. It's not intellect. It's actually this stuff, and we don't teach anything about that, right? We don't even ask, right? And so I find that also yet another kind of like, I wonder why we don't do that when it's so important.
That's why I asked that question at the beginning of the interview. I have been asking for years now. Who are you in your own words? How do you see yourself? To me, that's fundamental. That's essential, because the way you see yourself, that tells me what your life will be about, and what your life is
Yeah.
about. So, just to wrap it up, maybe at the end, I have so many notes here. The keys to purpose. How would you summarize that? What are the most important keys?
I would say that I think all 10 are actually quite important, but rather than just listing the 10, I think that the main idea is, number one, when we're born into this world, the world or the society is not actually designed to help us find our purpose. Fundamentally, it's just not how we built it, right? And so it's important then to understand that all the messages that you're hearing about what you should be doing with your life, they are not actually really designed for you to maximize your happiness, right? I mean, it's not to say that they're meant to hurt you in some horrible way, although sometimes that can happen actually, but they're also not designed for you, right, in particular. And so that's kind of big insight number one. So if you're not supposed to be listening to the outside world then for that reason, then what are you supposed to be listening to? And of course, that's what's inside you, right? And that's what we don't really have a great infrastructure to help people kind of get to. Your stories were often, it sounded like a lot of meditation, a lot of self-reflection. Some of that applied to me too. But it's not like someone gave a book on meditation to me when I was in school, right? I stumbled into it because I was looking. And so, I think that's another huge thing, is that that's a you can't skip that step if you're gonna want a high quality of life, and especially if you want to find purpose. You're just not going to be able to skip that step. And then the last part is really about manifesting, and you can't do it without a vision, right? With the exception of a small number of people who get their calling from the sky, wherever that is, everyone is basically in need of a vision, right? And the only person who can create that is you. And the only way you can make sure it's the right one is by knowing, again, what's going on inside you, right? Who you are. So those would be the main ideas.
I love the intention also behind your work. It's very sincere. You I mean, it's just beautiful. I can't say that enough. It's beautiful. That's what we need. We need more, even though it's not being taught in schools, society's not designed for it, but you're doing this work already. It's more and more people are attracted to the internet, to technology, to podcasts. A lot of people, I mean, I hear from so many people, and I know from my own experience doing this, but also from other huge podcasters out there doing this work and how impactful they are. So we do have a voice, and we do have a vision in that sense. Thank you so much for kind of co-creating that vision together, you and I
Sure.
here, and everyone who watches and comes across this recording. Thank you so much again for your presence in our reality and for your beautiful intention, for your heart, really. At the end, I want to mention your website, so bryanhong.me. So that will be clickable on the podcast notes. And you have your book is on Amazon. You offer workshops, individual sessions, and you also have a blog at Substack. Did I miss anything?
You didn't. I've done the blog in a long time, so I'm one of these people that might not necessarily come back to that. But yes, the other stuff is definitely still live and active. And most importantly, anyone who wants to reach out to me, definitely can.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'll have all the information here. Thank you so much again, and we'll talk soon. Bye for now,
Okay.
Bryan.